Yevamos Daf contains three primary sugyas. The first is the sugya of the child of an Isser Asay. Is he a cholol or not? If it's a Kohen Isser Asay. The second is the sugya of a Kohen who's allowed to be matame to his sister. What if his sister is married? What level of marriage disqualifies him from being able to be matame to her after she dies? The third sugya will be that of the din zona as it applies to a gioris less than 3 years old. When does she have that din? When does she not have that din? And how do you understand the psukim discussing the Milchemes Midyan, which is related to the topic? The Gemara will then go into Milchemes Midyan somewhat at length with a bit of Begadita, discussing how they were able to tell the women who are Ba'ulos from Basulos. All this is related because it's all surrounding the halachos of when a Kohen Gadol is allowed to marry a woman, which women are pasul, which women are mutter for a Kohen Gadol to marry. So let's begin with that. As we've seen, the Torah says that a Kohen Gadol is not allowed to marry almana, ugusha, v'chalal, lezona. It says, "Es eila lo yikach." These three are lav. That's an almana, a gusha, and a zona. Zona we've defined somewhat, it'll be defined further. These three are a lav. Then it says, Ki imsula me'ama vikach isha. He has a mitzvah say to marry a besula. The Gemara here is discussing what happens if he marries a mafuta or an anusa. That is a woman who was never married. She's not an amana, she's not a grusha. However, she did have being in her life. Either ba'ones, she was raped, or she was seduced. Either way, she is included, simple pshat, in the Isser Asay. That is, she doesn't qualify as a psula. If a Kohen Gadol were to marry her, he would violate the Asay of Ki Imsul Me'ama Vikach Isha. He would not violate any Los Asay. Now we know that a Los Asay of Kohanim that creates a child who's a cholol. The question is, what about the child of this relationship? So we've seen earlier that it's a mchokes between Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov and the Chachamim. Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov says the child is a mamzer, and the Vlad is a cholol. That is ruined for its kahuna, and the Chachamim say the Vlad is kosher, the Vlad is not a chol. So the Gemara discusses the halacha of here. So the Gemara first says Rav Huna said in the name of Rav, and Rav Gidl said in the name of Rav that halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, that the Vlad, the child, is a cholol. Gemara has a different version of this, that Rav Huna said in the name of Rav. What is the reasoning of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov? His reasoning is that he goes according to Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer was of the opinion, which we've seen earlier, that any intercourse, any physical relationship between two unmarried people or people who are not married to each other is a isser of zona, and that creates the din zona. If that would be the case, then this woman who is an anusa or mafuta, she qualifies as a zona. If she qualifies as a zona, then she would be a violation of a lav for the Kohen Gadol to marry. And therefore, it's not a question of what's halacha of the Isser Asay of not being a psula. Here it's a question of a lav. So according to this explanation of Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov's opinion, that is Rav Huna name of Rav's explanation, Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov holds that the reason the child of this relationship becomes a chol is because it's a lav of zona. So Gemara says that can't be the correct pshat of Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov for the simple reason that the halacha is always like Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov. We say Mishnah Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov kav v'naki. He didn't say much, whatever he said, the halacha is like that. However, Rav Amram has said that the halacha in this case, at least Rav Amram said the name of Rav, the halacha is not like Rabbi Elazar. The halacha is not like Rabbi Elazar. That means that this woman does not get a din zona, and yet al-pi halacha, and yet we paskin al-pi halacha like Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov, that she does create a cholol with this marriage. So obviously those two halachas can be dependent on each other. So what then is the pshat? So the Gemara goes further. So the Gemara says, okay, kasha. It's a kasha on that pshat. And the Gemara says that Rav Ashi has a different explanation of what Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov and the Chachamim are arguing about, and he says they're arguing about whether there is a chol created by a Isser Asay. That is, there is no din zona here. We're not passing like Rabbi Eliezer. We're just saying this is the only Isser, the only reason that a Kohen Gadol is not allowed to marry a Mafuta or an Anusa is because she is not a B'sula, and therefore it's violating the mitzvah Asay to marry a B'sula only. And the question is, does a violation of an Asay create a chol or not? Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov says yes, and the Rabbanan hold that it does not. Now, what is the reasoning behind that machlokes? So the Gemara says Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov learns it out of the pasuk. It says Amar Gusha v'chalal zona es ela lo yikach. Ki im b'sula me'ama v'yikach. So it lists the three lavin, almana, grusha, chalal, zona. Then it says, elo yikach, you shouldn't take these. And then it says, ki im b'sula me'ama v'yikach. And right after that, it says, v'lo yichalal zaro ba'amav. And then that will not create, if we'll follow these rules, will not create an issue of halal, v'lo yichalal zaro. So you see, that's going back on all four of them. The three lavin and the essay, all of them create a chol if he violates them. So that's Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov's opinion. That's why he holds that a chol is created by violation of the Yisur Aseh of Kiyum Psul Me'am Vikach Isha. Now the Rabbanan disagree, and they say that it says Es Eila in the middle. It divides the three lavin from the one Aseh by saying Es Eila. Amar Gush v'chalol is zona Es Eila Levikach. Then it says Kiyum Psul Me'am Vikach Isha. That clearly shows that those three are separate. Those are the three to which we apply when it says V'lo Yichal Zaro Ma'amav. However, Kiyum B'sula does not have lo yichal. Now, what does Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov do with the phrase es eile? Where it says that's eile, that's to exclude a nida. A kohen who's together with his wife and she's a nida does not create a chol. Now the Gemara quotes a brisa that has that drasha. The brisa says me'eile. The word me'eila teaches that a chol comes from these three isurim, does not come from a nida. And where says that brisa going like Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov, because he's darshing the pasuk the way Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov does, not like anyone else. Now the Gemara says contrary to Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov, though we have a problem. And the phrase in eila, es eila, if it's just meant to teach me nida, it does not have to be written between the three lavin and the one I say. It could be written at the end of all four. So the Gemara leaves that as a kasha. The Gemara does not have a resolution to that. Okay, now the Gemara goes to the sugya of achoso. The halacha is that a kohen is not allowed to become tamei for anybody except his 7 close relatives. He's allowed to be metamei to take care of the body of his sister after she dies. However, that's only if it's his sister who is a bsula or single. And the way the Torah phrases that is v'la achoso ha-bsula ha-krova elev asher lo hosa le'ish. A number of phrases there. Achosa, who is basula, who is krova, who is elav, who is lo hoselish, lo yitama. To her, he can be metame. So the Gemara wants to know here it says basula. So how do we define basula here? So there's a number of different halachic questions. The first one is, what's the halacha of an arusa? What if she was engaged to someone? She had kedushin. She never had nesuin. She was never nival. She's still a basula, but she had kedushin. So here the Gemara says it's a machlokes Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda against Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yehuda says she's still considered to be basula. He could still be metamei to her. Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon say no, she's already out. Cannot be metamei to her. Now, an anusa and a mafuta are definitely not. They're definitely not a basula. Everybody agrees he cannot be metamei to her if she's anusa or mafuta. Mukas eitz. So the Gemara says here you have a split in the opinions of Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon. Here Rabbi Shimon sticks with his opinion and says that he cannot be metamei to her. It's just like an arusa. Here Rabbi Yossi though breaks off, and Rabbi Yossi goes with the other opinions, which Rabbi Yossi doesn't quote by name, but Rabbi Yossi goes with Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda would seem, and he says that he is allowed to be metamei to her if she's just a mukas eitz. She just had a tearing of the basulim by a non-physical bia, not through a bia, just through an insertion of some other object. Now the Gemara has one more case, and that is a begeres. Begeres, the Gemara says everybody agrees that a begeres does count as a psula for this, even though begeres who's older than the age of 12 and a half does not have her complete psulim. We've seen there was a machlokes whether Kohen Gadol is allowed to marry her. However, begeres, everybody would agree that she is considered a psula as far as this halacha, and he is allowed to be metamei to her sister when she is a begeres. Now the Gemara notes in the end of the brisa, the Reb Shimon says that the halachos of a Kohen being metamei to his sister, and the halacha of who a Kohen Gadol is allowed to marry are both the same. They're both called a psula. Whoever is kosher for a Kohen Gadol to marry, a Kohen is allowed to be metamei to his sister if she's in that state. The two halachos are the same. Now the Gemara is going to analyze these halachos more in detail, step by step. So the Gemara says, first of all, what is the pshat and opinion of Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda? How do they darshan the pasuk? What does each phrase in the pasuk mean? Now they, as we have said before, they said that in arusa is considered a psula. He is allowed to be metamei to an arusa. She is considered a psula. So how do you read that? So the Gemara says they read it as follows. It says v'lachosa ha-psula. B'sula, the word b'sula means she has to be a virgin. A b'sula, that's to exclude an anusa and a mafuta. Even though she's not married, she's not a b'sula. She's definitely out. Now, what about a mukas eitz? So they say as follows. So you would think to exclude mukas eitz. So it says asher lo hosel ish. The only thing that excludes her, that takes her out of the din psula here, is if she was together with a man. Mukas eitz, everybody agrees, is not called hosel ish, and therefore that phrase hosel ish, that she was not with a man, that says that a mukas eitz is not disqualified. Now, what is the word hakrova for? So here, Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Huda start finding their shita. So they say that when it says hakrova elov, hakrova is to include even an arusa, and arusa counts as krova, and the word elov is to include even a begeres. So now the Gemara asks, hold on a second, begeres we need a pasuk for? What do you mean? We're in the opinion of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir we saw earlier in the halachas of Kohen Gadol, where it says bivsu leha, he learns three stages out of the word bivsu leha. He says that just the word bsula alone, I would have just said bsula, I would have assumed that that means that even if she just has part of her bsulim there, she still counts as a bsula. So bageres counts as a bsula. That's not the final halacha according to him, but that's the meaning of the word bsula. Now here it says the word bsula. So if that's the case, so the word bsula should just be enough to say even a partial bsula. Why do I need a pasuk to say that a bageres also counts as a bsula? Just the word bsula should say that even a bogeres counts as a psula. That's how Meir said it, as far as the halachas of Kohen Gadol are concerned. So Meir says, yes, that's true, that should be enough. However, since a Kohen Gadol is possible to marry a psula, as we learned in the drashas there from the word bivsu leha, the extra beis and yud, you may think to learn from that din psula to this din psula, and that she doesn't count as a psula if she's a bogeres as far as this halacha as well. Therefore, we need an extra special limud over here to be included from the word elov. Now, how does Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon learn this? Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon, how do they understand the words of this pasuk? So they, as we said before, they hold that a woman who is an arusa, a Kohen's sister who is an arusa, is not considered a bsula, even though she never had any bia, but just the fact she's an arusa takes her out of the din bsula, and her brother cannot be matame to her. So they read the pasuk as follows. When it says that excludes in anusa, a mafuta, and a mukas eitz. All of those are excluded by the phrase besula. All of those don't count as a besula. They don't have besulim anymore. Now, therefore, we do not need the phrase asher lo hosel ish to exclude a mukas eitz, and that therefore is meant to exclude in arusa. An arusa does not count as a besula as far as the halacha, excluded from lo hosel ish. She counts as having been hosel ish. She has been engaged. She is nisaris to a man. That counts as hosel ish. The word havaya, hosa, generally indicates kiddushin. Now, the word hakrova, where it says hakrova elov, what does hakrova mean? That's to include an arusa shenis garsha, someone who was an arusa and was divorced from her erisin. She does count as a psula, and her brother is allowed to be metame to her. Now, elov, that word is her brother is allowed to be metame to her. It's not true. We said before that Reb Shimon, who were in that opinion, says that the rules of besula as far as the halacha of her brother being metame to her parallel the rules of Kohen Gadol being able to marry her. A Kohen Gadol is not allowed to marry an arusa shenis garsha. She counts as a woman who is misgareshes. So certainly she's possible for that. So how could you possibly learn from here that she is allowed to? So the Gemara says this is an exception to that rule for the simple reason that you have Xeris HaKasav here. Normally, you would say that the rules of Kohen Hagadol would follow it. However, there's an exception because it says Krova, that's Xeris HaKasav. Now, some of the Acharonim here point out that the comparison to Kohen Gadol was only meant to define Psula. The Psul of a Arusa has nothing to do with Psula. It's not because she's not Psula. It's an Arusa Shenis Garsha. The problem is not that she's a Psula. The problem is that she's a Migureshes. She's a Grusha. That's a totally different halacha. That has nothing to do with, you won't find a Kohen Gadol being mutter to her because it didn't grusha. That it doesn't tell you about the din psula. That's a whole different halacha. So now the Gemara asks, what about a mukas eitz? Why don't you include the word mukas eitz from the word krova? You said the word krova could include somebody. Mukas eitz can include krova. So the Gemara says, no, you can't use mukas eitz for krova because mukas eitz is already being used to include a arusa shenis garsha. So the Gemara says, well, how do you know you should use it to include an Nizgarsha? Maybe it should be used to include Mukas Eitz. Why is one better than the other one? So the Gemara says, well, a Mukas Eitz had a physical change to the body. She is no longer physically a psula. Therefore, we would prefer not to include her. She is less likely to be included than in Arusa Shenizgarsha, who never had any physical change. She had a Kedushin, and she broke the Kedushin, but she never had any physical change there. Now the Gemara analyzes the opinion of Rabbi Yosi. So Rabbi Yosi broke ranks with Rabbi Shimon, and he went with Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Huda in the case of a Mukas Eitz. How is Rabbi Yosi going to learn the psukim here? He can't possibly say this full drasha the way it is. So how does he know that a Mukas Eitz is considered a psula as far as these halachas? So the Gemara says that Rabbi Yosi learns it out from Haisal Ish. A Mukas Eitz is not Haisal Ish. He agrees with the drasha as it was said by Rabbi Huda and Rabbi Meir that Haisal Ish shows that it has to be someone who was physically with a man, not someone who was pierced by any other object. So Gemara says, what do you mean? Rabbi Yosi held like Rabbi Shimon as far as what Haisal Ish is for, and he said that is to teach me to exclude an arusa. Haisa he learned as Haviyasa for an arusa. So how could he then use it for this drasha? Gemara says simply, it says loy haisal ish, loy haisa, that's to exclude an arusa. That's where the word haisa is from arusa. Leish is to a man as opposed to a piece of eitz. That's what excludes that. Now the Gemara goes into the word elov. So we said elov to include that a bogeres is considered a psula. So the Gemara has a kasha on this, is that we're in the opinion of Rabbi Shimon here, and that's Rabbi Shimon learned in Hilchos Kohen Gadol that the meaning of the word b'sula, had it only said b'sula, not b'suleha, that would have meant that it has to be, the only thing that's defined as a b'sula is where all the psulim are there, that she's not a bogeres, and a bogeres does not count as a b'sula. So how here could he say that a bogeres does count as a b'sula? Where it says, no, here there's a drasha that says it, and that's where Shimon gets his halacha. That's how he knows that the word b'sula means only a less than bogeres, and bogeres doesn't count as a psula. From the fact that the pasuk elov here had to add on a psula, means had it not said elov, the word psula would have meant that a bogeres is left out of this halacha, and that's why he says in Hilchos Kohen Gadol that when it says that he's supposed to marry a b'sula would have meant, had adjusted psula, not b'sula, it would have not included a bogeres. Now the Gemara goes to a new sugya, and that's the sugya of Gioris. The halacha is that a Gioris counts as a zona. Even if she never was physically with any man, just the nature of a Gioris, in her previous existence, she was Hefker, and therefore she has the halacha of a zona, and a Kohen Gadol are usher to marry her as a zona. Now, the Gemara says, Rosh Yochai says, if she converted when she was less than 3 years old, she does not get the din zona. She doesn't count as a zona, and she's mutter to Kohanim. That is not because the bia of a child less than 3 years old doesn't count as a bia, because even if there's no bia, there is no, the Gzeir Sekasa here that he's saying a special halacha, there is no din zona on a woman who converted when she was less than 3 years old, or 3 years old and less. What's the source for that? So the Gemara says the source is from Mechemes Midyan. Over there it says, all the children, the female children that did not know any lying with a man, can keep alive for you, meaning that the Jewish soldiers were allowed to marry her. Now, one of those soldiers was none other than Pinchas, who was a Kohen, and it's saying that he's allowed to marry her. Keep alive for you. So there you clearly see that Pinchas, who was a Kohen, is allowed to be together with him. How is that possible? Because it's a taf, because we're talking about children who don't count as nashim, and there's no din zona on them because they'd be converting less than 3 years old. So the Rabbanan argue on Rishon and Bar Yochai. The Rabbanan say, no, there is a din zona there. So what do they do with this? It's clear here that there is no Isser. They are allowed to marry a Kohanim. So the Gemara says, the Rabbanan learn that here when it says Hachayu Lachem, it doesn't mean Hachayu Lachem to marry. Hachayu Lachem here means Hachayu Lachem to be your Shifcha, to be your Shifcha. That is a different halacha. That has nothing to do with the din zona. It's not saying that they don't have a din zona. They have a din zona, but they're allowed to be a Shifcha. Says the Gemara that can't be the pshat. It can't be that they're being kept as a shivcha, because then what does it in 3 years have to do with anything? It should just dinner whether they were nevelis or not. What does taf have to do with anything? What is 3 years significant here? So the Gemara says no. Rav Shimon bar Yochai had to talk about 3 years old because there's a seer in the psukim. The question that's asked by Rav Huna, and the answer is a contradiction. So first it says as follows. First it says v'chol Isha yodas ish lemishkav zachar haroigu. It says that any woman, meaning an adult woman, not a child less than 3 years old, she should be kept alive if she never had mishkav ish. That means that what is the status of a woman who's an adult depends on whether she had bia or not. That implies that a child does not depend if she had bia or not. A child you can keep alive no matter what. But there the pasuk that says it says that a child you should keep alive if they did not have bia also. That's a contradiction. The first pasuk implies that child there's no rule of bia. The second one says that there is. So you have to say then that what it means to say is we're not differentiating between a woman and yodas ish. Not talking about a woman who is a psula and a child who is a psula. We're talking about women that is by definition yodas ish, an adult is by definition called yodas ish, and a taf banashim is by definition not yodas ish. That means when it says yodas ish, it doesn't mean actually beula, it means roi lebia, old enough that their bia could count. And that's what it means to say. That's what the Torah is. Therefore, makbid, that the din, it doesn't matter whether you're talking shivcha, eved, isha, the Torah is saying is that anyone who's roi lebia, who's an adult, who's over 3 years old, them are not saved, and the ones that are children, that are tough, those are the ones that are saved, those are the ones that are not roi lebia. Okay, now the Gemara says, but how do they know? How do they know the age? So the Gemara says, well, first the Gemara brings a brisa that goes through this drasha specifically and shows that this was the contradiction in the psukim. This is how we know that that's what the pasuk was referring to. So now the Gemara asks, how did they know the age? The Gemara says, Rishon Chassid said they passed them for the tzitz. Any woman who was old enough for bia, she was older 3 years and 1 day, her face turned green. Any woman whose face did not turn green, she was kept alive because it was known that she was not old enough to be roi lebia yet. Says Rav Nachman, similar to that, is similar of an avera, the sign of a woman who did an avera is a greenness of the face, a hadrokan. Now, the Gemara says a very similar thing is found in the story of Pilagish Begiva, when there was a war between Shevet Binyamin and other Shvatim, and they punished some families that didn't go to the war. The inhabitants of Yavesh Gilad were punished. Over there it says that a lot of the women were saved, 400 girls were saved, and they were married to Shevet Binyamin. Those were the 400 women who were psula shelo yodu mishkav zachar. The Gemara says, how did they know which women had mishkav zachar or not? So the Gemara says, Rav Kana said they put them on top of an open chavis, on top of an open barrel of wine. If she was a be'ula, then there was an odor that arose. If she was a psula, there was no smell. Says the Gemara wanted to just pass it before it tzitz. The Gemara says the tzitz only helps in a case of ratzon, in a good case, like conquering Midian. It does not help in a bad thing like this war with the Jews of Yavesh Gilad. So Gemara says, but what do you mean Midian was also a bad thing? Midian was bad for the Midianim. Gemara says, no, we mean a good thing for Klal Yisrael and a bad thing for the Chavim. That counts as a good thing. Now the Gemara goes into whether or not the halacha is like Rav Shimon bar Yochai about his halacha, which he said that a woman who converted under 3 years old does not have a din zona and she is kosher to Kohanim. So the Gemara says that Rav Idi bar Yaakov said in the name of Rabbi Shua ben Levi, the halacha is like Rav Shimon bar Yochai. Rabbi Zera said to Rav Yaakov bar Idi, it was Rav Yaakov bar Idi who said it, and Rav Zera said to Rav Yaakov bar Idi, did you hear this halacha explicitly? You have a Masorah that he said this, or did you learn this out from something that happened? Now what incident happened that he was afraid he learned it out from, and why did he feel like that was not a good place to learn it from? So the incident that happened was that there was a city in Eretz Yisrael, that there was a rumor, there was suspicions happening about one family there, and Rebbe sent a messenger to check it out, Rabbi Rumnus, and checked it out. He found that there was a girl who converted when she was less than 3 years old in 1 day, and Rebbe was machshir her to Kohanim. She was married to a Kohen, and Rebbe said she's allowed to stay married to her husband, the Kohen. So that's the case, where it seems to be fulfilling the halacha like of Shimon bar Yochai. So Yevamos wants to say maybe this is what we were relying on. If we didn't have a specific misorah that that's the halacha, we were just surmising from the story. Now, why would that be a bad assumption? Why is that not a good way to learn? So Gemara says maybe it's different here because she was already married. And maybe they allowed her to stay married only because she was married already to the Kohen, but we would not lechatchila allow somebody because halacha is not really like Rishon Marichai lechatchila. So the Gemara says, you could see that there's such a concept of allowing a woman to stay married even though she shouldn't marry him in the first place, because Rav and Rabbi Yochanan both said that a Bogeres and a Mukas Eitz should not marry a Kohen Gadol, and if they did, they're allowed to stay married. Someone says, what do you mean? How can you compare the two? There they let them stay married because the concept of a Bogeres and a Mukas Eitz is something that's going to change anyway. A Kohen Gadol, he's never going to stay married to a Bogeres and a non-Mukas Eitz, a non-Bogeres and a non-Mukas Eitz. Through their lifetime, she's going to lose her psulim, and she's going to become a Bogeres. That is a logical reason that we said, you know what, if they're married, let them stay married anyway. But over here, she became a, if she had the din zona, you wouldn't say, well, she's going to become a zona anyway when she's married to him. That's for sure not going to happen. That's not what we're saying. So you cannot compare the two. So who says you could learn one from the other? Therefore, there's no problem. And even if the source was not from a Masorah, the source was only from that story is a good source. The Gemara says Rav Safra Taka learned that it was learned from that source, and he asked the kasha like we asked. He asked the kasha, maybe she was only allowed to stay married, and he answered like we answered, that you cannot learn that halacha out of the din of a Bogeres and a Mukas Eitz. Now, it brings an incident. There was a Kohen who was married to a Gioris who converted when she was less than 3 years and a day old. And Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said to him, what are you doing? You're not allowed to do that. So he said, why? Rav Yaakov bar Idi said, in the name of Rav Yeshua ben Levi, that the halacha is like Rishon Marichai. So he said, go divorce her, get rid of her, and if not, then I'm going to turn over Rav Yaakov bar Idi from your support. Meaning I'm going to put you in Chayrim, and then you won't be able to claim any support from Rav Yaakov bar Idi anymore.